Okay, gang, so Thomas Jefferson is president, and we are gearing up for one of the most important, if not the most important thing that he did as president. I have this map here. You should have looked up the answers in Module 7, Lesson 5, and answered the questions 1 through 6 here. I'm going to go over those answers with you. If you have any questions, you can message me. And then I'm going to walk you through the next step of today's lesson. If you missed class, we're going to read through a couple paragraphs about the Lewis and Clark expedition and answer some questions. So number 1 asked what the Mississippi River was used for. Number 1 is labeled. Up here, it shows where the Mississippi River is on a map of the United States of America. And the answer is American farmers were using the Mississippi River to ship their crops to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. New Orleans is labeled with a number 2, in case you're wondering where that is. It's the big black dot down there on the coast, right along the Mississippi River. It's where the Mississippi River dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very important port, very busy, and gives you access to the rest of the world. If you can get your goods down the Mississippi River and out through New Orleans, you have access to the whole world. So that's what the American farmers were using the Mississippi River for. But who owned New Orleans? Spain owned New Orleans. So we had sort of an okay relationship with them. Sometimes we ran into problems where they didn't want to let us use it. It definitely wasn't smooth all the time, and it would have been nice if we could have had control of that. What did Spain do with the Louisiana Territory and New Orleans? That is number 3 you can see over in Europe. Spain is labeled there. You can see where Spain is in relation to some other countries in Europe, such as France, which is also labeled. They gave it back to France. And at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, you've probably heard of him but might not know a lot about him, but he basically became emperor of the French Empire. They gave it back to France in 1801, and it was kind of a secret treaty that the United States did not know about. So when the United States found out that Spain had given the Louisiana Territory to France, we were surprised and actually a little bit concerned. What happened in Paris? Of course, Paris is labeled with a star there in France because it's the capital. Thomas Jefferson was president at the time, and he decided to send a couple diplomats over to Paris to negotiate with the French a possible purchase of New Orleans. He said, okay, go over there. I don't like the fact that they have control of that port. I don't trust Napoleon. He really cannot be trusted because he's always invading other countries, and he's basically trying to take over the world. So I don't want him to be my neighbor, number 1. Number 2, I definitely don't want him controlling the port because he might just cut it off and not let us use it anymore. So he sent Livingston and Monroe, that's James Monroe, who will later become president, over to Paris to offer to buy New Orleans. And he tells them, you can spend $5 million. Don't spend any more than $5 million, but see if they'll let us purchase the city of New Orleans for $5 million. So they go over to France, and that takes us to number 5. They're negotiating with the French, and the French actually come back and say, well, how would you like to just purchase the entire Louisiana Territory, which you can see shaded there on my map? It covers the area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. He said, how would you like to just purchase the whole thing for $15 million instead? Well, of course, Livingston and Monroe are extremely excited, and they send word back to the president and say, look, this is the deal that they came back with. What do you want us to do? And of course, Jefferson says, oh my gosh, let's buy it. I was willing to offer $5 million for a city. If I can double the size of our country for $15 million, I'd say that's the deal of the century, maybe the millennium. So he says yes. So France sold the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803 for $15 million. And it essentially doubled the size of our country overnight. But not everybody thought that this was a great idea. Number 6, how did the purchase of Louisiana cause a controversy in Washington, D.C.? Critics in D.C., mostly from the other political party, complained that the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional. The Constitution never gives explicit power to the president saying that he can purchase land. And the fact that Thomas Jefferson had always been a strict interpreter of the Constitution and always said that the government shouldn't do anything that's not in the Constitution definitely presents a problem here. And this is where it shows him to be a hypocrite. He goes back on what he's always been saying for decades because he just could not say no to this deal. The deal was just too good to pass up. So there you go. Those are your answers to that activity. I hope that shows not only visually where these things are, but also why it was such an important purchase. As you can see, it's a very huge area. So now that the United States has purchased this land, wouldn't it be nice to know what we just purchased? Yes, I think so, because for the most part, we didn't really know. It was sight unseen. So the next activity that we did in class was to read this little article. It's only a couple paragraphs long. We read this together and then answered the questions in the Word document that's attached to today's page. So you'll need to download that document if you haven't already and answer those questions after I read through this with you. And I've underlined some important things to focus on. So in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Purchase from France, expanding the borders of the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. The vast areas of unexplored country offered the new nation the potential for growth and the possibility of a practical water route all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson had for years been fascinated by the unexplored territory west of the Mississippi River, and in June 1803, he announced plans to send an expedition overland to the Pacific. The president chose his close friend, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the expedition. Lewis selected his friend and former commanding officer, William Clark, to serve as co-leader of the expedition. The objective was to explore the Missouri River to its source and establish the most direct water route to the Pacific. They were instructed to write detailed accounts of their journeys, make maps, and provide information about the Indian tribes indigenous to the West. In addition, Jefferson expected them to make scientific and geographic observations of all they saw. In 1804, Lewis and Clark, along with 45 men and a dog, began a journey that would take 3 years and cover territory that would later encompass 11 states. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803 to 06 was a monumental event that shaped the boundaries, character, and future of the United States. The courageous explorers traveled up the Missouri River, across the Great Plains, over the Rocky Mountains, down the Columbia River to the shores of the Pacific and back again. Although a great deal has changed during the past 200 years, many of the sweeping landscapes and powerful waters so eloquently described by the Corps of Discovery have been permanently protected for future generations. The National Park Service today has the honor of preserving and managing numerous areas and programs that acknowledge or are related to the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Corps of Discovery is commemorated in areas as diverse as Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia, Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in Missouri, Knife River Indian Villages National Historic Site in North Dakota, Nez Perce National Historical Site in Idaho, and Lewis and Clark National Historical Park in Oregon and Washington. And I've added plus Pittsburgh because just in the last year or so, the government officially recognized that the beginning of the Lewis and Clark journey did not start in Missouri. It actually started in Pittsburgh. So we should be on the lookout for some historical markers and perhaps some federal regulation of land in Pittsburgh and possibly even in Beaver County, because he did travel up through Beaver County That's Meriwether Lewis, by the way. He did travel from Pittsburgh up the Ohio River into Beaver County as he made his way over to the Missouri River to meet up with William Clark. So that's some cool local connections for you there. Now, the questions that you need to answer are in a Word document, but I have put the answers in this PowerPoint so I can have some visuals to show you as well. I'm going to go through those answers, and as always, you can just press pause whenever you need me to stop talking so you can enter information into your document. So we're just doing part 1. Part 2 will be your assignment for tomorrow. Number 1 asked, what was the territory that was purchased? And of course, that's the Louisiana Territory, which you see in brown here. And this map does a nice job of showing how it really did double the size of our country. And most notably gives us access to the Gulf of Mexico, because you can see it stretches down through New Orleans and to the mouth of the Mississippi River. Number 2, what was the objective of their expedition? It was to explore the Missouri River to its source and establish a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. That's highlighted because that will be a question on your test at the end of this unit. Do they achieve their objective? No, not really. They do not find a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. They tried, but they couldn't find one because one does not exist. They did have to go over land for much of the trip. And what instructions were they given? They were told to write detailed accounts of their journey, which they definitely did. Lewis and Clark kept very detailed journals with not only entries that they were describing what they saw and what they experienced, but also illustrations. They drew pictures of the plants and the animals and the people that they met. That was published, and it's actually a book that you can purchase and actually read straight from them what they were experiencing and what that was like. They were told to make maps because we did not really know what we had just purchased and we needed to map it out. They were told to gather information about Indians in the West. There are so many different tribes that lived out there that we were not familiar with. They wanted to establish peaceful relations with those Indians, not start any trouble. And finally, they were told to make scientific and geographic observations. That is highlighted because it will be on the test at the end. So what was the geography like? What was the topography like? What's the weather like? What are the animals like? All of that needed to be recorded because we really didn't know. And number 3 asked, what was their route? And you can break it down into sections here, just like the story did. So they went up the Missouri River. The shoving off point was historically speaking, it was St. Louis, although now people are saying it was actually Pittsburgh. So, but for the purpose of this, we'll say St. Louis is where they met up and they shoved off. And they went up the Missouri River, and then they spent the winter at Fort Mandan. You can see it labeled there in North Dakota. And then after the winter, they're going to cross the Great Plains. And then they're going to go over the Rockies, which would have been the most challenging part of the journey for sure. You have to find just the right spot to go through. And then down the Columbia River so that they could get to the Pacific Ocean, which is where you see the yellow star that I put on there. So the yellow stars indicate where they started and where they ended. And then, of course, they're going to come back. The journey to get out there is in yellow. And then the journey to come back is in red. And you could see that they split up for a little while, trying to find if there was another way that they could go, another way that might provide a direct water route. But then they ended up meeting up again in North Dakota and basically traveling the same path to Fort Mandan. So that's their route. And that covers part 1. Now your assignment is to read the link that is on today's page about Sacagawea, a famous lady that helped them on their journey, and answer the questions that are in part 2 of your Word document.